guys, welcome back to my channel. Now in the next few tutorials you may notice a slight difference. Now in this period of uncertainty I don't have access to my normal recording or baking equipment because I'm also changing location, but don't worry, I've come up with a few back to basic recipes which involves no fancy equipment or ingredients. So I hope you enjoy these recipes, I hope you try them out, and most importantly, stay safe. So lots of you requested choux pastry, so here it is. Now it's not a normal pastry recipe, it's actually quite different, and I'm convinced that it was made by accident just because it's not a typical pastry method. Nevertheless, it's really different and actually quite easy to make. You just need to know what you're doing, of course. So we start off by putting water directly into a pan, along with a little bit of salt and sugar, and some butter as well. Now it doesn't matter how soft the butter is because we're going to put this on the stove to heat up. So the butter's going to melt anyway. So I've put it on a medium to high heat because I want to start melting the butter and then bringing this to a boil. So I'm just going to give it a little stir just to help the butter melt in. And I want to bring the flour close to the pot because as soon as the water and butter starts boiling, I want to add the flour as quickly as possible. So now the water is boiling, I can add the flour all in one go and quickly stir. So that's really important to start stirring as soon as the flour's in. And what will happen is the mixture thickens up, and keep stirring because you're cooking out the flour. And you know when it's ready, when it's kind of clumped together and moves freely around the pan, and you can see little traces of pastry left on the pan. So that's ready. And then this goes straight into a bowl to cool. So I'm going to just use the spoon and spread it up the sides to make it cool quicker. You can see how hot it is. And we're going to add the eggs next. Obviously, if you add the eggs now, the heat of the pastry will start cooking the eggs, which we want to avoid. So I'm going to leave this here to completely cool. So once the pastry is completely cool, it's kind of solidified slightly. So I'm just going to break it up with a spoon and then break up the eggs before adding half of the eggs into the mix. So now we're looking for a specific consistency of dropping consistency, which I'll explain when it's at that stage. But it is a little bit difficult to mix the eggs in this stage. It does require a little bit of a workout, but it really helps using a wooden spoon or something quite stiff because it can be quite stiff to mix in. So once those eggs have mixed in, I can now add more eggs. So every time I add the eggs, I'm going to add half of what's left. So I'm adding the eggs in stages and mix that through. And I'm going to repeat this until I achieve the right consistency. Now, you may not necessarily need all the eggs, or you may need to add some more. It basically depends on how much you cooked out the flour at the beginning. So I'm just going to test it. Now, dropping consistency is when you pick up the dough and it drops within 3 seconds. Now this was quite slow, which means it needs loosening up just slightly more, so I'm going to add a little bit more egg in, give it a good beating, and then try again. So 1, 2, 3, and it's ready. So that is what you're after. So now I can fill a piping bag. So I've got a round nozzle here, I think it's a size number 10, and I'm going to put it inside the piping bag and trim off the end and put it into a tall container to make my life that little bit easier. So I'm going to put the mix straight into the piping bag. And now it's ready to pipe. So I've got a tray here, and to stick the paper down and make sure that it doesn't fly around in the oven, I'm just going to line it with a little bit of softened butter, and then I can spread the paper down. So that's quite a good trick. Especially in a fan oven, the paper can fly around quite easily. And now it's time to pipe the profiterole. So I'm squeezing about 2 inches of pastry, and I'm finishing it off with a little bit of a flick because I don't want a point. So don't pull up when you're piping, kind of drag it slightly to the side so you don't get that peak. This takes practice, so don't worry if you don't get it straight away. So I'm leaving like a 2-finger gap between each profiterole because they're going to expand when we cook them. And I want the size of the profiteroles as even as possible, so the first couple were a little bit small, so I'm just going to fill it up with a little bit more pastry. And then I'm just going to brush some egg wash over the top. Now the egg wash gives the profiteroles a little bit of a shine, but it also helps get rid of any points of pastry that occurred when I was piping. So the oven is preheated at 190 degrees Celsius, so quite high, and these are going to cook for about 20 minutes until they've puffed up and they're dry on the inside. So while the profiteroles are cooking, it's a good chance to make your creme patisserie filling because we need to wait for this to cool slightly. So to start, I've got a pan of milk, which I'm going to flavour with vanilla. So I've only got vanilla paste with me, but you can use a vanilla pod. And then I'm going to heat that up until it's steaming. Whilst I'm waiting for the milk, I'm just going to break up my egg yolks and then add the sugar to the egg yolks and then mix it straight away. If you leave sugar on egg yolks, it kind of burns the yolk, so you want to get that mixing as soon as the sugar goes in. I'm going to whisk it until it's lightened in colour. And once they're a bit paler, you can now start sieving in the flours. So here's the plain flour and then the corn flour, and you can sift them in together and mix it into the egg yolk. Now if you put the yolk straight into the hot milk, it can suddenly cook the egg yolks. So I want to bring the yolks up to temperature. So I'm going to pour half the milk into the yolk and then mix that in. And that's warmed the yolk up slightly before I add it to the rest of the pan. So the heat is on medium, and then I'm basically going to continue whisking it here. So at the moment I just want to make sure that all the egg yolk is mixed in, and as this heats up it starts to thicken because of the added flour. So it's kind of like a thickened custard. The whisk helps it get nice and smooth, and eventually it really thickens up, and you know it's ready when it starts to bubble from the bottom. So it's starting to bubble, so now I can take it off the heat and transfer it into a bowl to cool. So you can really see how thick this has got. I'm just going to scrape the last bit out with a spatula because I don't want any to go to waste. And then cover it with a layer of cling film and press it down, otherwise it will form a skin. And now leave this to completely cool. So it's been about 22 minutes and the profiteroles are cooked. So I've got some really nice round ones here. They've puffed up really nicely. There were a couple that were slightly flatter, and I think it's to do with the oven. I don't think the oven that I'm using circulates the air enough, and I don't think they dried out properly. I'll just show you what's inside one of the flatter ones. You can see it is quite moist, and I can feel that it's not 100% dried, whereas the outer edge ones did. It's just about knowing your oven at the end of the day. But what I want to do is poke a hole in the bottom, because this is where we're going to fill the creme patisserie in. So I'm actually just using a metal straw here, but you can use the end of a pencil or a little piping tip, whatever makes a hole. It's a lot easier to poke the holes while the profiteroles are still hot because they're slightly crispy too. As they cool down, they start to get a little bit soft. So as the creme patisserie cools, it solidifies, so it needs knocking back, which basically means whisking up again. Now you can do this on a mixer, but I don't have one, so I'm going to do it by hand. And this was quite a workout. I had to keep swapping hands during this. And I'm basically going to whisk it until it's nice and smooth. So it's still holding its shape, and now's the time to flavour it however you want. So you can obviously leave it vanilla, but I'm going to dollop in a large amount of Nutella, because why not? Nutella also mixes in really smoothly, so I like adding spreads to creme patisserie to flavour it. So I'm just going to mix the Nutella in until it's fully incorporated. Now you can see I didn't really measure it, so I'm just going to try a little bit just to make sure it is Nutella-y enough, which it is, so I can fill my piping bag with the flavoured creme patisserie. And now I'm ready to fill the profiteroles. So I'm not using a nozzle here, I'm just going to cut off the very end and avoid getting it on the profiteroles. And now it's a case of putting the end of the piping bag into the hole I created and squeezing as much as possible and filling the whole of the inside of the profiterole. And you know when it's full, when the piping bag is almost forced out and the filling starts to come out the hole. So the pastry starts off as a really light shell, and then as you fill it with the creme patisserie, it obviously gets really heavy. So you can tell when each one is full. You can basically fill these with anything you want. I think creme patisserie has the right balance of being light and creamy and yet full of flavour. I feel like whipped cream is slightly too light and just Nutella is a bit too intense. But you can fill them however you want. So to decorate the top of the profiteroles, I've made a simple ganache by heating up the same amount of double cream and chocolate in the microwave and mixing it together until it's smooth. And then I'm simply going to dip the top of the profiterole in and then leave it on the side to set. So I'm giving each one a nice covering. And you can dip these in coloured fondant or plain chocolate. I actually like the balance of the dark ganache with the Nutella inside. I think they complement each other really well. And just to tease you, I'm going to tear one open so you can see how packed the choux pastry is. And there you go, that is how you make choux pastry or profiteroles. So you can use the same pastry to make eclairs or a Paris-Brest if you want to get really creative, but this is the pastry in its simplest form. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please try them out and tag me at George's Cakes as you've been doing. I've loved seeing you make all of these recipes. In the meantime, please subscribe to my channel, more tutorials on the way, and we'll see you very soon.